Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. The Terminus Hub hung in the dark void of Sector 9, like a rotting steel carcass. It was a chaotic dumping ground for the galaxy's unwanted souls, exiles, disgraced bounty hunters, and desperate scientists with ruined reputations crawled through its narrow, rust-stained corridors every single day. The station's life support systems wheezed constantly, fighting a losing battle against the cold vacuum outside. Neon lights flickered above the main promenade, casting sickly shadows over the faces of those who had nowhere else to go. Inside the rusted hull of the sector's most notorious tavern, the air was uncomfortably thick with the stench of cheap synthetic alcohol and unwashed bodies. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder, a sea of aggressive noise and quiet misery. Yet, in the very center of this suffocating crowd, a wide ring of empty space remained completely undisturbed. It was an island of isolation in an ocean of chaos. At the absolute heart of that empty circle sat Valia. She was a silicon-based life form, her skin a complex mosaic of dark, crystalline plates that absorbed the dim tavern light. She sat completely motionless, a solitary living statue amidst a storm of loud conversations and clinking glasses. No one dared to approach her. No one even dared to look at her for too long. The reason for this distance was entirely invisible, yet biologically impossible to ignore. Valia radiated an aura of pure toxicity. Her scent was heavy, invasive, and aggressively lethal to the comfort of the carbon-based lungs. It was the sharp, suffocating smell of burnt ozone mixing heavily with volatile synthetic chemicals and the bitter dust of arid, dead earth. Just stepping within 15 feet of her caused throats to tighten dangerously, eyes to water, and lungs to burn. The patrons gave her a wide berth, whispering cruel insults and treating her like a walking plague. She was used to it. The profound isolation was a familiar, heavy cloak she wore every single day. The heavy tavern doors slid open with a metallic screech. Alejandro Alford stepped inside. Alejandro was a man who looked like he had carried the crushing weight of a dying star on his shoulders for 100 years. He was a trained botanist and a planetary terraforming specialist, though those titles meant nothing right now. Unemployed and stripped of his life's purpose, he moved with the sluggish, heavy steps of a man who had entirely given up on the universe. His clothes were stained with engine grease and dead soil, his face unshaven, his eyes hollow and devoid of whatever spark had once driven him to breathe life into dead worlds. He walked straight toward the bar, his direct path naturally intersecting with the toxic boundary that surrounded Valia. A scarred bounty hunter grabbed his arm, shaking his head and pointing a warning finger at the silicon alien. Alejandro merely pulled his arm free without uttering a single word. He did not care about their warnings. He did not care about the sharp burning sensation that immediately began to prickle the back of his dry throat. With deliberate footsteps, Alejandro breached the dead zone. The loud murmurs in the tavern suddenly died down. Dozens of eyes watched in morbid fascination, fully expecting the foolish human to collapse clutching his chest, choking on the chemical fumes. Alejandro reached the bar counter. He pulled out the rusted metal stool right next to Valia and sat down heavily. The harsh sound of the metal legs scraping against the floor echoed loudly in the sudden silence of the room. Valia slowly turned her crystalline head, her inner light pulsing rapidly with a volatile mixture of confusion and intense caution. Humans were notoriously fragile creatures. Their soft pink lungs were completely incompatible with the volatile elements her body naturally expelled. A normal human would be gasping for breath right now, desperate to escape her vicinity. Alejandro did not gasp. He ordered a shot of the cheapest synthetic liquor from the robotic bartender. The machine poured the dark liquid, and Alejandro picked up the small glass with a steady hand. He leaned back in his chair, settling right inside the thickest part of Valia's toxic cloud, and took a slow, deliberate sip. He swallowed hard, closed his heavy eyes for a brief moment, and then exhaled deeply, letting her scent fill his lungs. He turned his head slowly to look directly at Valia. His voice was low, incredibly rough, and completely devoid of any fear. "It reminds me of home," he said. Valia froze completely. Her advanced internal processors raced at maximum speed, analyzing his heart rate and vocal fluctuations for any sign of deception. There was absolutely none. He was breathing her highly toxic air, the very scent that drove hardened mercenaries to their knees. And he was completely, terrifyingly calm. Astonishment washed over her, quickly followed by a sharp, defensive guard snapping into place. She knew the genetic frailty of his species all too well. There was absolutely no logical way he could endure her presence so easily unless he was hiding something profound and dangerous. Yet, as she stared intensely into his exhausted, hollow eyes, she saw no trickery. She only saw a profound reflection of the same vast, crushing emptiness that she had lived with for her entire existence. The ambient noise of the tavern seemed to dull as Viola processed the human's impossible resilience. She observed the way his chest rose and fell, unbothered by the caustic air separating them from the rest of the room. "Earth is a paradise of nitrogen and oxygen," Viola said, her voice a resonant, metallic hum that vibrated through the sticky surface of the table. "Your respiratory system should be failing right now. My dermal emissions are lethal to your kind." Alejandro scoffed quietly, tracing the rim of his glass with a calloused thumb. "I have never seen Earth. My lungs were forged on a dying rock called Aegis 7. It was a terraforming colony, a massive atmospheric engineering project that went horribly wrong 42 years ago." He took another slow, deliberate drink. The atmospheric processors ruptured. They flooded the entire hemisphere with raw ozone, industrial sulfur, and synthetic decay. Millions suffocated in a matter of days. The few of us who survived adapted to breathe the poison. Your scent, the chemical burn, the ash. It is the exact composition of the wind blowing through my childhood bedroom window. The defensive tension in Viola's crystalline shoulders eased slightly. She had lived a life entirely defined by the physical repulsion of others. Yet here was a man who found absolute comfort in her toxicity. "I am not a naturally occurring anomaly," Viola confessed softly, the metallic timbre of her voice dipping into a lower, mournful frequency. "I did not evolve on a toxic world. I was designed in one of the subterranean laboratories of the Apex Syndicate." Alejandro's hand stopped moving. The name of the ruthless underground cartel carried a heavy weight, even in a lawless place like this space hub. "I am a biological prototype," she continued, her gaze fixed on the table. "A living incubator meant to synthesize volatile compounds. I escaped their containment grid 3 years and 6 months ago. Since then, I have been drifting, hiding in the darkest corners of the sector, using my own toxic nature as a defensive shield to keep the bounty hunters away." For the next 2 hours, the space between them transformed from a barren wasteland into a sanctuary of shared grief. Alejandro ordered another round of drinks, pouring his cheap liquor while Viola absorbed trace minerals from a specialized nutrient vial she carried. They traded fragments of their shattered lives. Alejandro spoke of his desperate, failing attempts to bioengineer resilient flora capable of scrubbing the poisoned air of his homeworld, a mission that ultimately left him bankrupt and exiled. Valia shared the sterile horror of the Syndicate labs, the endless surgical experiments, and the profound emptiness of being treated purely as a weapon of mass destruction rather than a living, feeling being. As Alejandro listened to her tragic history, his trained botanical mind began to piece together a startling correlation. He leaned closer, intensely examining the faint, rhythmic glow pulsing beneath the dark plates of her skin. The chemical signature she passively expelled was not just a random mixture of industrial waste. "The specific compounds you secrete," Alejandro murmured, his eyes widening with a sudden, brilliant realization. "They are not just toxic byproducts. The molecular structure of your emissions matches the exact biological catalysts I designed for rapid cellular regeneration in dying plant life." The Syndicate was not just making a weapon, Valia. They were playing with the fundamental building blocks of planetary genesis. Before Valia could fully process his revelation, the heavy iron doors of the tavern blew open with a violent, deafening crash. The ambient chatter instantly died, replaced entirely by the heavy, synchronized thud of armored boots. 6 figures clad in matte black tactical gear marched into the establishment. The crimson insignia of the Apex Syndicate glowed menacingly on their reinforced chest plates. They spread out immediately, raising biometric scanners and locking down all possible exits. "Random identification sweep," the lead mercenary barked, his voice heavily distorted by a mechanical vocal modulator. "Keep your hands visible on the tables. Anyone attempting to flee will be neutralized on sight." Panic rippled through the crowded room, but nobody dared to move a muscle. Valia's inner light flared a bright, terrified orange. The Syndicate had finally caught up to her. Once their advanced scanners picked up her unique silicon signature, she would be dragged straight back to the subterranean testing chambers. "They are looking for me," Valia whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough to crack the composite material. "Do not move," Alejandro commanded in a fierce, urgent tone. He reached deep into his heavy coat and pulled out a battered, cylindrical device. It was a portable, industrial-grade oxygen generator, a relic from his terraforming days. He quickly unscrewed the pressure valve and snapped the primary intake tube, completely overriding the internal safety protocols. "Lean in close to the table," he instructed, twisting the device's output dial to its maximum threshold. Alejandro slammed the heavy generator onto the floor between their boots and activated it. Instead of a steady stream of clean air, the overloaded machine violently expelled a dense, freezing cloud of pure, concentrated oxygen and thick water vapor. The sudden burst of heavy mist swallowed their table entirely, creating an intense, localized thermal shock that completely scrambled the ambient air density. The sudden flood of pure oxygen actively bonded with Valia's toxic emissions, rapidly oxidizing the unique chemical markers into a harmless, odorless mist. Simultaneously, the extreme thermal interference created a massive blind spot on the mercenaries' thermal and biological scanners. 2 heavily armed Syndicate soldiers approached their section, waving their scanning devices aggressively through the thick, swirling vapor. The scanners beeped erratically, struggling to read anything through the dense cloud of freezing oxygen and moisture. "What is this mess?" one of the guards growled, waving his gloved hand through the blinding fog. "Broken life support module," Alejandro slurred loudly, perfectly playing the part of a heavily intoxicated mechanic. He kicked the sputtering generator with his heavy boot. "Junk keeps venting coolant. I am trying to fix it." The guard sneered in total disgust at the grimy human and the freezing vapor, his scanner showing nothing but a chaotic temperature anomaly, giving them a dismissive wave. The soldiers moved past their table, continuing their sweep towards the back of the dark tavern. Valia sat perfectly still in the freezing mist, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm as she watched the crimson insignias slowly fade into the shadows. The journey into the lower bowels of the station took exactly 45 minutes of agonizing stealth. Alejandro led Valia through a labyrinth of forgotten maintenance shafts and rusted ventilation ducts, moving steadily further away from the habitable zones. The air grew thicker, vibrating heavily with the massive, rhythmic thumping of the central exhaust turbines. Finally, he pried open a heavy steel grate, revealing a hidden space that defied all logic within the decaying station. It was a secret botanical greenhouse, hidden inside a decommissioned exhaust chamber. Alejandro had built a desperate sanctuary. Rows of makeshift hydroponic beds lined the curved walls, illuminated dimly by the sickly purple glow of dying ultraviolet lamps. However, it was a tragic graveyard. The soil was gray and brittle. Hundreds of rare, engineered seedlings hung limply from their support wires, their leaves curled and blackening from severe nutrient deprivation and the station's relentless atmospheric corruption. Viola stepped cautiously into the chamber. As the heavy hatch sealed shut behind them, her crystalline skin pulsed, and her thick, chemical scent instantly flooded the enclosed space. Alejandro moved to the main control terminal, fully expecting his fragile, dying plants to instantly wither completely under the intense toxicity of her presence. Instead, an absolute miracle unfolded before his eyes. It started with a faint, papery rustle. A single, blackened vine nearest to Viola suddenly shivered. The sickly gray color of its leaves began to recede, chased away by an aggressive, vibrant burst of emerald green. Alejandro froze entirely, his jaw dropping into pure disbelief. The phenomenon rapidly spread. Within 60 seconds, the dying flora across the entire chamber violently reacted to Viola's invisible emissions. Withered stalks straightened with explosive vitality. Tiny, dormant buds ripped open, blooming into massive, luminescent flowers that pulsed with newfound energy. Roots tore heavily through the dry soil, expanding wildly as the plants eagerly absorbed the heavy ozone and synthetic chemicals radiating from the alien woman. "This is biologically impossible," Alejandro whispered, rushing toward a rapidly expanding fern. He grabbed a portable multi-scanner from a nearby workbench and aggressively swept it over the revitalized leaves, then pointed it directly at Viola. The device chimed rapidly, projecting a bright holographic stream of complex molecular data. Alejandro stared intently at the floating numbers, his scientific mind struggling to comprehend the massive paradigm shift. "Your scent," he breathed heavily, turning to look directly at her. "It is not a corrosive chemical weapon. These are biological nanospores. Highly advanced, programmable organic matter. They are aggressively repairing the damaged cellular structures of these plants. You are not destroying the environment. Viola, you are actively regenerating it on a massive, terrifying scale." Viola lowered her gaze, her internal light shifting to a soft, serene blue. "When the Syndicate created me, my original genetic code was designed to be a planetary defoliant," she confessed, her voice echoing clearly in the now vibrant greenhouse. "They wanted a living weapon to sterilize entire continents for military occupation. But during my long confinement, I gained access to their central data mainframe. I saw the total destruction they caused. I saw the cosmic rot, the biological plagues they intentionally unleashed to subjugate independent star systems. So, I spent 2 long years slowly rewriting my own DNA." She stepped closer to a massive, glowing flower, gently touching its wide petal. "I altered the fundamental purpose of my spores. I turned the weapon into a cure. My emissions carry the exact genetic countermeasure for the cosmic plague currently ravaging the outer colonies. That is why they are hunting me so ruthlessly. If I am free, their monopoly on the galaxy's suffering ends completely." Before Alejandro could fully absorb the monumental weight of her words, a violent explosion ripped the thick steel hatch completely off its hinges. Blinding tactical lights violently pierced the purple gloom of the greenhouse. 4 Apex Syndicate mercenaries stormed through the smoking breach, their heavy pulse rifles raised and ready. They had successfully tracked the sudden, massive spike in biological energy. "Target acquired. Engage, but keep the alien intact." The squad leader roared over the chaotic noise. Deafening gunfire immediately shredded the confined space. High-velocity plasma bolts tore heavily through the newly grown vegetation, instantly vaporizing thick vines and showering the room in burning green sap. Alejandro grabbed Vialia's arm and threw her violently behind a reinforced steel water tank, just as a barrage of plasma melted the control terminal he had been standing near seconds ago. The air quickly became a suffocating storm of smoke, flying debris and searing heat. The mercenaries advanced systematically, cutting down the new jungle to get to their prize. "Stay completely down!" Alejandro yelled over the deafening crossfire. He scrambled on his hands and knees through the dense, rapidly regenerating undergrowth, sliding desperately toward a specialized containment locker at the far end of the room. He punched in a heavy numerical code, ripping the door open. Inside rested a row of glass spheres filled with a dark, volatile powder. They were his personal defensive creations. Highly engineered, pressurized pods containing potent neurotoxin spores derived from predatory flora. Alejandro grabbed 3 of the heavy glass spheres. He primed their caps, stood up bravely from his cover, and hurled them directly at the advancing squad. "Breathe this in, you corporate parasites!" he screamed loudly. The glass spheres shattered forcefully against the armored chest plates of the mercenaries. A thick, inky black smoke erupted instantly, expanding outward with violent speed. The engineered spores easily bypassed the standard filtration systems of the Syndicate helmets. Within 3 seconds, the front 2 soldiers dropped their weapons, violently clawing at their throats as the paralytic toxin aggressively seized their respiratory muscles. They collapsed entirely, convulsing wildly on the floor. "Move now!" Alejandro commanded, grabbing Vialia and sprinting toward a secondary hidden ventilation grate behind the large nutrient vats. The remaining 2 mercenaries fired blindly into the dark smoke. Plasma bolts violently scorched the walls and shattered the remaining lights. Alejandro kicked the heavy grate open, shoving Vialia safely into the dark, narrow tunnel. He turned quickly to follow her, but the toxic smoke briefly cleared, exposing his position completely. A sharp, compressed hiss sounded clearly over the chaos. Alejandro felt a sudden, agonizing punch in his left shoulder. He staggered forward, falling hard into the metal ventilation shaft. He reached up quickly and blindly ripped a sleek, metallic dart from his flesh. The needle was thickly coated in a glowing crimson liquid. A terrifying, icy numbness immediately exploded from the deep wound, racing aggressively through his veins and paralyzing the nerves in his arm. It was a military-grade, synthetic neurotoxin, specifically designed to violently shut down a central nervous system in a matter of minutes. His vision blurred violently as he collapsed heavily onto the cold floor of the shaft. He had managed to save Vialia from immediate capture, but as the crushing weight of the sudden paralysis rapidly spread to his chest, he realized his own life was now dangerously ticking down by the second. The pitch-black maintenance shafts of the Terminus hub were not built for biological comfort. They were suffocatingly narrow, stinking heavily of stagnant water and decaying thermal insulation. Vialia dragged Alejandro's dead weight through the claustrophobic maze, her crystalline hands gripping his heavy jacket with desperate strength. His breathing was a wet, ragged rattle echoing loudly against the tight, metallic walls. The military-grade neurotoxin was aggressively devouring his nervous system, paralyzing his muscles one by one. They reached a dead-end junction, a cramped square barely large enough for 2 people to sit shoulder to shoulder. Vialia carefully lowered Alejandro to the cold, grated floor. Total darkness enveloped them, broken only by the faint, rhythmic blue pulsing of her own alien skin. Alejandro's eyes rolled back, his body convulsed violently, striking the metal walls with brutal force. The potent poison was plunging his mind into a horrific delirium. His gaze darted blindly around the small space, seeing nightmares instead of the rusted pipes. "The processors!" Alejandro choked out, his hands weakly clawing at his chest. "They are rupturing! The sky is burning red! I cannot stop the sulfur! I cannot breathe!" He was no longer on the space station, in his dying mind. He was back on Aegis 7, exactly 42 years ago, watching his entire world suffocate. He reached out blindly, his trembling fingers brushing against Valia's face. "I am sorry," he whispered brokenly, hot tears mixing with the cold sweat on his face. "I tried to plant the seeds. The soil is too dead. Everyone is burning." Valia grabbed his flailing hands, her heart aching at the immense sorrow radiating from his fragile frame. He was dying rapidly. In less than 3 minutes, his heart would stop completely. The ambient nanospores she released into the air were simply not concentrated enough to fight a direct injection of military poison. There was only one terrible, incredibly risky option left. She reached into Alejandro's utility belt and pulled out a heavy field medic syringe. With zero hesitation, she pressed the thick needle directly against her own forearm. She bypassed the hard, crystalline plates and drove the sharp metal deep into the soft, glowing tissue beneath. She gritted her teeth against the sharp, searing pain as she aggressively extracted her own raw biological fluid. It was the absolute origin of her scent, a highly volatile, liquid concentration of her regenerative nanospores, glowing with blinding, brilliant blue energy inside the glass tube. Valia pulled the needle free, immediately pressing it against the swollen, blackened vein pulsing frantically on Alejandro's neck. "This will burn," she whispered softly in the dark. She pushed the plunger all the way down, flooding his failing human bloodstream with pure, concentrated alien biology. Alejandro arched his back violently. A terrifying, inhuman gasp tore from his throat. The glowing fluid raced aggressively through his veins, visible under his skin like branching rivers of blue fire. As the concentrated spores violently collided with the deadly neurotoxin, a massive biological shockwave exploded inside his brain. Suddenly, Alejandro was completely ripped out of his own mind. The dark shaft vanished entirely. He was violently thrust into a blindingly sterile, white room. Searing surgical lasers sliced directly into his flesh. He felt an agonizing, cold pressure clamping down on his limbs. He heard the clinical, merciless voices of syndicate scientists recording his screams as purely biological data. He felt the crushing, endless weight of 1,000 days locked in a dark, silent box. He felt a profound, galaxy-spanning loneliness that was so heavy it made his soul want to fracture. It was not his pain. It was Vialia's. The liquid injection had forced a temporary, raw, telepathic bridge between their nervous systems. For 60 agonizing seconds, Alejandro endured the absolute hell of her entire existence. He felt her deep fear of her own body, her sheer desperation to be something other than a weapon, and the quiet, fragile hope she felt when he sat beside her in the tavern and told her she smelled like home. As the shared agony peaked, the pieces of the puzzle brutally snapped together in Alejandro's enhanced consciousness. He saw the ultimate truth hidden behind the syndicate's cold eyes. They never wanted to cure the cosmic plague. They engineered the disease specifically to cripple entire star systems. They wanted to capture Valia, to permanently monopolize the absolute only cure in the universe. They would let billions rot, only offering salvation to those who willingly submitted to total corporate slavery. The aggressive blue fire under his skin slowly faded. The horrific visions receded, slamming Alejandro harshly back into his own physical body. He gasped deeply, his lungs expanding with incredible power. The paralysis was completely gone. His eyes snapped open, blazing with an intense, unnatural clarity. Before he could speak, a sharp crackle of static broke the silence. Alejandro's portable comms unit, lying discarded on the floor, suddenly intercepted a heavily encrypted, localized transmission. The brute force of his newly enhanced cognitive processing instantly translated the military code. A cold, mechanical voice filled the narrow shaft. "Target containment failed. Initiate Protocol 0. Seal all bulkheads leading to the lower hub. Divert main reactor exhaust into the quarantine zone. Incinerate the entire lower sector. Leave absolutely no witnesses alive." Alejandro slowly sat up, his muscles bunching with a strange, newly forged strength. He looked at Valia, who was slumped against the wall, utterly exhausted from the severe biological extraction. The Syndicate was not just hunting them anymore. They were preparing to burn thousands of innocent exiles alive, just to bury their terrible secret in the ashes. The burning urgency of the intercepted transmission forced Alejandro to make a desperate gamble. They had less than 30 minutes before the lower hub turned into a massive incinerator. He led Valia through the decaying ventilation maze toward Docking Bay 7, seeking the only person wretched enough to ignore station lockdown protocols. Silas was an old smuggler, a former terraforming pilot who had traded planetary soil for illegal cargo decades ago. Alejandro found him deep inside the greasy underbelly of his rusted freighter. Silas listened to their plea, his greedy eyes lingering heavily on Valia. For the price of a rare botanical seed bank, Alejandro had hidden off-world. Silas agreed to bypass the blockade and fly them out of the system. It was a fatal miscalculation of trust. The moment Alejandro and Valia stepped onto the cold metal grating of the main launch pad, blinding floodlights snapped on, instantly erasing the shadows. Heavy blast doors slammed violently shut, sealing off the exit. Dozens of laser sights painted bright red dots across their chests. Silas stepped out from the shadows behind the heavily armed Syndicate strike team, nervously counting a thick stack of digital credit chips. "I am sorry, old friend," Silas muttered, refusing to meet Alejandro's furious gaze. 10 million credits is a lot of money. The Syndicate pays much better than dead plants. Before Alejandro could react, a massive electromagnetic pulse net deployed from the ceiling, violently crashing down on them. The intense electrical charge instantly paralyzed his muscles, dropping him hard to the deck. Two towering mercenaries grabbed Valia, dragging her violently toward a massive, heavily armored containment transport resting in the center of the bay. The transport doors hissed open, revealing a brutal piece of machinery. It was a mobile, biological extraction chamber, a nightmarish cage of thick glass, heavy cables, and jagged surgical shunts. The mercenaries shoved Valia inside, locking her into the metallic restraints. The Syndicate commander, a tall man with a scarred face and a cruel smile, walked over to where Alejandro lay paralyzed on the floor. "You have been a massive thorn in our side, botanist," the commander sneered, kicking Alejandro hard in the ribs. "But your little rescue mission ends here. We have the cure, and we are going to bleed her dry to synthesize our monopoly. As for you, I want you to enjoy a front-row seat to the vacuum of space." Two guards hoisted Alejandro up and dragged him toward the outer airlock of Silas's freighter. They threw him violently inside the cramped steel box and slammed the heavy reinforced door. Through the thick observation window, Alejandro watched helplessly as the commander pressed a button on an external control pad. The warning klaxons blared loudly. The airlock's external venting sequence initiated. Alejandro immediately felt the massive pressure drop. The oxygen was being aggressively sucked out of the small room, violently pulling the air straight from his lungs. The cold vacuum of space began to bite at his skin. He collapsed to his knees, his vision dimming as the commander laughed silently on the other side of the glass, preparing to leave with their prize. Despair threatened to crush him entirely, but as his heart hammered a frantic, dying rhythm, the alien blood in his veins flared with a sudden, violent heat. The biological fluid Valia had injected into him began to aggressively rewrite his failing nervous system, keeping him conscious past the point of human failure. Then, a profound revelation slammed into his mind, echoing from the brief, telepathic bridge they had shared. Valia had known, during their shared mental link. He had felt her deep, cold logic. She had run a complex behavioral algorithm on his memories of Silas. She had predicted the smuggler's betrayal with a 99% probability. She had allowed herself to be captured. The biological fluid she gave him was not just a medical cure to save his life. It was a highly advanced, living biological skeleton key. She had encoded a massive system override command, specifically designed for the Syndicate's central extraction chamber, directly into the nanospores now circulating in his blood. She needed him inside the network to trigger the destruction from the inside out. He just had to survive the next 30 seconds. Fueled by the aggressive alien energy surging through his muscles, Alejandro fought against the crushing vacuum. He dragged himself off the floor, his ears popping violently, his eyes bloodshot and bulging. He lunged toward the locked electronic control panel near the door. He did not bother looking for a password, using his bare hands, enhanced by the synthetic strength of the spores. He violently ripped the heavy steel faceplate completely off the wall. Sparks rained down as he exposed the raw, tangled optical wiring. His engineering mind, trained to build complex life support systems for entire planets, rapidly analyzed the circuitry. With his lungs screaming for air and the edges of his vision turning completely black, he grabbed two thick power cables. He forcefully jammed them together, completely bypassing the safety relays and intentionally short-circuiting the main decompression valve. A violent shower of electricity exploded in his face. The venting sequence aborted immediately. The external doors locked down, and a massive rush of emergency oxygen flooded back into the tiny room. Alejandro collapsed hard onto his back, gasping wildly, filling his burning lungs with sweet, life-saving air. He stared up at the ceiling, wiping a trail of blood from his face. The Syndicate thought they had buried him, but they had merely planted a seed of their own absolute destruction. The central control tower of the Apex Syndicate loomed over the upper districts of the hub like a brutal iron spear. Heavy security bulkheads, guarded by elite shock troops, stood firmly between the hangar bay and the executive levels. Normally, a single botanist would not survive 30 seconds against such an impenetrable fortress. But Alejandro was no longer just a fragile human being. The alien biological fluid pumping rapidly through his veins had completely rewritten his physical limitations. He moved with the terrifying speed of a predatory strike, his muscles fueled by an aggressive, living energy that absolutely refused to let him fail. He ripped a heavy plasma rifle from the hands of a stunned guard, crushing the thick composite barrel with his bare hands just to prove he could. He did not fire a single shot. Instead, he used his incredible momentum to crash violently through the reinforced glass of the main security checkpoint. The remaining mercenaries fired their weapons, but Alejandro was already moving faster than their targeting algorithms could accurately track. He vaulted over the steel barricades, his heavy boots deeply denting the metal floor panels, and tore his way up the central stairwell toward the extraction chamber. Inside the vaulted, sterile white room of the control tower, the Syndicate director stood triumphantly over the mobile containment cage. He was a ruthless, corporate architect of misery, carefully adjusting the precise dials on the massive centrifuge that was currently hooked directly into Vaelia's crystalline spine. "Initiate the primary drain," the director commanded his two lead technicians, his eyes greedy with the dark promise of endless wealth. "Extract every single drop of the catalyst. I want her completely hollowed out in exactly 10 minutes." Before the technicians could engage the massive industrial turbines, the heavy titanium blast doors of the chamber completely buckled inward. With a deafening shriek of tearing metal, the massive doors were violently ripped off their hydraulic tracks and thrown across the expansive room. Alejandro strode through the thick smoke, his eyes glowing with the exact same brilliant blue fire that naturally radiated from Vaelia. "Kill him right now!" the director screamed, scrambling backward away from the central console in total panic. The heavily armed guards immediately raised their weapons, but Alejandro slammed his right fist directly into the main power junction on the closest wall. He did not just break the circuitry. He violently drove his glowing, spore-infected blood straight into the station's raw fiber optic network. The biological skeleton key Vaelia had given him activated the very second it touched the digital stream. The highly advanced nanospores aggressively hijacked the massive digital mainframe. completely rewriting the space station's core operating system in a matter of only 5 seconds. The heavy magnetic restraints holding Valia violently snapped open all at once. "Do it now!" Alejandro roared over the chaotic sparks and wailing emergency alarms. Valia stepped confidently out of the broken machine. She did not attempt to run. She simply raised her arms gracefully, her dark, crystalline skin fracturing slightly to reveal an absolute blinding core of pure, concentrated life force. She unleashed a massive, unstoppable biological shockwave. It was not a destructive explosion of fire, but an aggressive eruption of profound genesis. A dense, brilliant emerald and sapphire cloud of pure regenerative nanospores blasted outward with the unstoppable force of a cosmic hurricane. The wave violently shattered the thick observation windows, completely consuming the terrified director and his elite guards. But the wave did not kill them. Instead, the aggressive organic matter instantly bonded with the synthetic energy cores of their weapons and heavy armor. Within 3 seconds, every single plasma rifle, energy shield, and combat drone in the room sprouted thick, unbreakable vines and heavy bioluminescent moss, completely disabling the Syndicate's technological superiority permanently. The explosive wave of healing spores did not stop in the tower, guided perfectly by the override Alejandro had planted in the mainframe. The station's massive industrial ventilation fans completely reversed their standard flow. They aggressively pumped Valia's potent scent straight down into the lowest, darkest sectors of the entire hub, in the miserable slums of the lower levels. Thousands of forgotten exiles lay dying from the cosmic plague, their skin covered in dark, fatal lesions, their fragile lungs failing. When the thick smell of burnt ozone and dead earth flooded their cramped quarters, many closed their weary eyes, falsely believing the Syndicate was finally gassing them to death to clean the sector. But the burning sensation never came. The heavy scent filled their ruined lungs, and instantly, the agonizing pain vanished. The aggressive nanospores ruthlessly hunted down the viral plague within their bloodstreams, tearing the deadly disease apart at a fundamental molecular level. Dark lesions faded rapidly into healthy skin. Feverish shivering stopped completely. Men, women, and children who had not stood up in 6 months suddenly found themselves breathing deeply, their bodies completely revitalized by the alien cure. The realization hit the massive population like a blinding lightning strike. The Syndicate had lied to them for years. The cure existed, and the corporate army had been selfishly hiding it right above their heads. A massive, unstoppable roar of pure, righteous fury erupted from the lower decks. Empowered by their suddenly restored health and driven by 10 years of brutal oppression, the entire civilian population of the space station rose up as one singular, violent force. Mechanics wielded heavy plasma torches. Cargo pilots grabbed rusted metal pipes. They flooded the main promenades in a tidal wave of vengeance, violently overwhelming the heavily armed but technologically disabled mercenary squads. The Syndicate's absolute control over the massive hub crumbled entirely in less than 1 hour, amidst the beautiful, chaotic symphony of the liberation. Alejandro and Valia moved swiftly through the overrun docking bays. They completely bypassed the ruined freighter of the treacherous smuggler and confidently boarded a sleek, heavily armored Syndicate warship that the mercenaries had abandoned in their sheer panic. Alejandro dropped heavily into the comfortable pilot's seat, his hands flying across the advanced navigation console with practiced, fluid ease. The main thrusters ignited with a deep, powerful hum, violently shaking the heavy ship as it confidently detached from the burning chaos of the liberated space station. Valia walked slowly onto the main bridge, her body no longer rigidly glowing with defensive fear, but radiating a soft, deeply calm light. She stood intimately beside his chair, looking out through the massive reinforced viewport at the endless, glittering expanse of the galaxy. "Where do we go now?" she asked softly, her metallic voice finally carrying the genuine, beautiful weight of hope. Alejandro looked up at her, a genuine, warm smile breaking through the heavy exhaustion on his scarred face. "We have a very fast ship. You have the ultimate cure. And there are thousands of dying worlds out there that desperately need to breathe again." He pushed the main throttle fully forward. The heavy warship shot instantly into the dark, welcoming void, leaving the decaying hub far behind, charting a brand new course toward the broken corners of the universe that were finally ready to be healed. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Sci-fi Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.